For once, this is actually a panel that really doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. At the end here, we have Ron Lieber from the New York Times, Jason Vitug from Frugal. I know that's cool. Lynnette Khalfani-Cox, the money coach. And of course, J.D. Roth, who just repurchased Get Rich Slowly. Can we have some? Ooh. Really happy to have you guys here. I'd like to start the session by asking each of you to describe 2 ethical dilemmas that you've wrestled with. One where you think you made the right decision, and one where you didn't or still have doubts. And of course, JD, I'm going to pick on you first.
So I've been blogging for a long time. As many of you know, I've been blogging since before blog was even a word. Over 20 years now. And at first I didn't blog about money. I didn't have any kind of advertising. There was nothing involved. And in fact, I was very much opposed to advertising on websites and advertising on blogs. I was very vocal in my friend circle about how putting advertising on blogs was selling out. And then when I started Get Rich Slowly, my primary objective was to help myself get out of debt and to learn about money. My secondary objective was to help other people, but I also had a third objective, and that was to make some money with the blog. And, well, Google offered AdSense, and so I put money on the blog, or put ads on the blog and started making money, and from there on out, I feel as if everything I've done online that involves money has required some sort of compromise. And some compromises have been bigger than others. I feel like, for me, everything I do ought to be in service of the readers. At the same time, as Liz said, I do want to make some money, right? Sometimes, as with AdSense, it's not that big of a deal because I don't feel like I'm really compromising the reader experience that much. But there have been some interesting ethical dilemmas or moral dilemmas that I faced. And because I now have access to the Get Rich Slowly email boxes again, I was able to dig back through for one that I remember very well. And let's see if I can find it here. So in early January of 2009, I was approached, just out of the blue, by a firm who asked, it says, your blog has been selected to participate in a new marketing effort by a company that I'm not going to name, designed to support their Invest First Visa credit card. And the offer they made is if I would run an article, basically a sponsored post or an advertorial, just one, they'd pay me $20,000. And $20,000 is a lot of money. For one article? Oh my gosh. And at first my reaction was no, because at the time at Get Rich Slowly, I was anti-credit card. I was like, no, don't use credit cards. And I had never made a penny. Well, the entire time I owned Get Rich Slowly, I made $0 from advertising credit cards. And so I had to really stop and think. This was on January 7th, it looks like. And I remember for 2 days, I talked about this with my friends, with Jim Wang, with Viet, or Cap, as some of you know him. And we just talked about this amongst ourselves. What are we going to do? Do we take the $20,000 and run the post? And in the end, I sent something back. And I said, you know what? Get Rich Slowly is the #1 personal finance blog on the internet. It's a trusted and respected source of information. And I went on and gave all, the accolades. And I said, I'm happy to work with you. I will run all sorts of display ads. I will give you unlimited display ads for 3 weeks. But I'm not going to do your advertorial. I'm not going to do your sponsored post. And I never heard back from them. So, but that was the right decision. I feel like that was the right move for me. A time that I'm not so sure I did the right thing was, honestly, the sale of Get Rich Slowly. I had reasons that I wanted to sell. Don't get me wrong, there were a lot of reasons I wanted to sell. I'm not going to go into them, but at the same time, I felt this struggle inside me. I'm like, I've built this relationship with my readers. I had 1 million people a month coming to visit the site. They trusted me. They followed my story. They'd been with me for years. And do I really betray their trust by selling the site, especially since I was required to, I couldn't publicize the fact that I sold the site. I had a non-disclosure agreement. And so I did sell the site, obviously, and then for 3 years I hung around and wrote for the site without mentioning the fact that I had sold it and carried on as if nothing had changed. And while I don't regret having done it, I don't know if that was the right move. I don't know how I feel about it from an ethical standpoint. And even now in the reacquisition of the site, some of the terms of the deal require me to do some things that I'm not 100% comfortable with. And yet, obviously, I did buy the site back, and that's because I think that ultimately it's for the greater good for me and the greater good for the readers of Get Rich Slowly. And time will tell if it actually works out for the best, but I think it will.
So I've had a number of situations where I've turned down offers for money and have not regretted it for a second. However, let me first start by telling you about the one that I actually, something that I do regret. So I've written a lot of books, and my first book that I wrote was a book called Investing Success. And I had Charles Schwab to write the foreword to the book, and I was coming out of my days as a full-time journalist. I worked for Wall Street Journal and CNBC. And long story short, I had a cosmetics company actually tell me that, oh, we want to sponsor your book in the book tour. We just want you to put an ad, a one-page ad in the back of the book. And, you know, they knew I was going to go all around the country and blah, blah, blah. And investing and cosmetics, there's no overlap there. There's not like terrible conflict of interest. It was actually a brand that I know, trust, and love very much and still use, and half of you in here I'm sure use it too. When they said to me, we want this page of advertising in the book, I like almost immediately recoiled. It was kind of like, what? Because of my background as a journalist, you know, I started my career at AP. I worked for Fox, 10 o'clock news in Philly. I worked for a Philadelphia Inquirer, Dow Jones, obviously the parent company of the Journal, CNBC. And I have a master's degree in journalism. So I sort of grew up in the tradition, unlike, you know, dare I say, many financial bloggers who probably didn't have the same sort of rigid rules in your head and what you can and should or would do, et cetera. I was already an entrepreneur. I had transitioned from my CNBC days by the time I got Investing Success going. But long story short, I was pretty much on my high horse. I was like, I had this mind like advertising and editorial, no, and the two shall never meet, you know. And I totally regret it. I should have put that damn ad in the book. I should have done that because there would have been no freaking conflict of interest. It was, you know, and later I was like, what was I thinking? Like how much of a, you know, editorial prude were you to just think that, you know? So anyway, I actually do regret that. And, you know, we can talk about subsequent experiences, but I've had, you know, when I left Dow Jones, for example, I later, you know, worked in different capacities doing some freelance stuff. And I've had editors there and elsewhere, and it's not a secret, I'm not sort of telling tales. I've had editors who said to me, because they know the brand that we've built and all that good stuff, yes, can you do some content? And do you know of partnerships that we can bring to the table? Essentially, they were like asking for corporate side of it. And I was like, whoa, the first time this happened to me, I thought that Chinese wall has really crumbled. There's no sort of quote unquote separation of church and state in the same way that it was certainly, you know, 15, 20 plus years ago. So anyway, that's one that I actually regret. This year, I had a company in the legal space that offers personal loans come to my husband and I. My husband Earl co-owns themoneycoach.net, our LLC, our financial education company. they offered us a very nice six-figure deal for me to do, frankly, a minimal amount of work. They mainly wanted to sort of license my name and brand and image, and they wanted to do some, a little bit of advertising around it. A teeny-eensy bit of work on my end. They just wanted me to help them to essentially sell or to make people comfortable with their loan products. So long story short, we were literally about to sign on the dotted line. And I was like, this is gonna be the easiest money I ever made, more or less. But my husband, being the vigilant Hawkeye that he is, contract came, and he noticed, in all candor, that the name that was on, when we got down to the details, the name on the contract was different. It was a variation of what had been sort of presented to us and the research we had done on this particular company to kind of feel comfortable with them, et cetera. When we further investigated, of course, I put my journalism hat on, I was like, absolutely not. A lot of negativity, bad reviews, and frankly, the loan products themselves that this other entity sort of offered, I was not comfortable with. It was like, I wouldn't recommend this to my mother or my sister, so I can't recommend this to consumers. So, last minute, we kind of said, no, can't do this deal. And, it was a little, they were like, what? Like, if it's about money, can it be more money? And I was like, there is no amount of money, just not gonna do it. So, and have no qualms or regrets about that whatsoever.
So just to put some context, I started as a blogger in 2013, and I jumped from blogging to creating events where I would partner with brands who would give me a ton of money. Then eventually got a book deal, and I speak all over the country talking about personal finance, financial wellness. So there's one, and I work with a lot of startups. So I'm from Jersey and moved out, lived in Silicon Valley, then moved back to Jersey. So I do work with a lot of startups, and there's one startup in particular who focused on payday lending, and they wanted to get someone within the millennial space, someone that had a reputation. I had my book out, and so they're giving me a very high five-figure deal to talk about their payday lending product. At that point, I did get a five-figure deal for my book. However, it wasn't that amount, so it's going to be double the amount that I got from my book advance. And what's interesting is, like, I debated it, thinking, well, this is a tech company, this is a fintech company, this is Silicon Valley. They really care about people, and they're using technology. And so it really did. It was about like a 60-day period for me figuring out, and we're going back and forth. And then I had to stop, and I had to look at, I work with a lot of credit unions, and I understand the mission, and they're doing a big service and trying to get people out of payday lending. And so it was at first a tough decision, but then an easy decision to say no to a lot of money to do very little work. Actually. So they just wanted me to put their logo on the website. They wanted me to do a couple of events. They wanted to use my book in some of their promotions. So that's one of like the dilemma that I faced. Another one I think that I somewhat regret, I was so adamant about working with credit unions. So I work about with 34 credit unions all across the country. And I wanted to get into regional banks, and credit unions would give me money to go do financial education events, pretty good money. And I had a hard time connecting with banks, big banks, small banks, or what have you, because I was a for-profit company and not a nonprofit. And so they wanted me to establish a nonprofit so they could fit into their CRA program. And then so I was like, nope, this is it. Big banks are really bad. Banks, period, are bad. But then I realized I was preventing myself from kind of extending my brand outside of just like this credit union bubble. So I think about that, and I noticed that they may be limited, or they're only focused on working with nonprofits to fit their CRA. But if I'm looking at my mission to empower disadvantaged communities, underserved communities, millennials, I should definitely have looked into that a bit further, or partnered with a nonprofit to make that deal happen.
First of all, thanks for having me. I feel like this is a murderer's row of badassery here. I'm just glad to be here. So I want to start by checking my privilege here and just acknowledging that I've got a day job that I'm lucky to have, but it also comes with some extremely strict ethical rules. So I'm coming at this from a place where I don't actually get to decide, and in fact there's somebody in a senior position at the New York Times whose job is in part to serve as a sort of ethical backstop, a decider in effect, who I can go to if I'm not sure about something, who will then say no most of the time. But before that, I worked in a bunch of different places, and there was a publication that I was involved with for a while where sometimes people would go off on speaking gigs at corporations for, decently sized amounts of money, and then they would come back from said corporations with story ideas about the corporation, which they would then write about. This is a place that most of you have heard of. That didn't make me feel so good at all. And while I did do speeches for money when I was associated with that particular entity, I did not ever take money from a corporation. And the reason why was that if you think that there's any chance, as I do and still, or as I did and still do in some ways, that you'll want to, make a career in journalism and stay in there for life, if you're taking money directly from, a particular corporation, you really can't, in good conscience, ever write about them again, ever, or at least not without a pretty severe disclosure, at least at many of the places that I've worked, and so that was how I handled that. And then I also spent about half a decade at the Wall Street Journal, where they literally would not let anybody speak anywhere about anything at all. Ever. And I showed up there with, one or two gigs on the books, and it was like a massive negotiation about whether I would still be able to go do them. And at the end of the day, I said to them, look, I'm a person of my word. I don't want to, blow off these places that booked me at the last minute. And they said, you can go, but we're going to pay for it, and you can't, take a cent from these places, and you can never book another speech again. So that was pretty severe. I didn't feel so great about that either. At the New York Times, it's a little bit different. We'll probably talk about that in a second. But some other ones that I've dealt with recently were all surrounding the publication of my book. 2.5 years ago, I wrote a book called The Opposite of Spoiled. It's all about how and when and why to talk to kids about money. And as any of you who have been mixed up in books know, not only do the publishers not really help you with the launches at all, sometimes they actually actively stand in your way. And so that was not the case with this particular publisher. But it's happened to me before, and I knew it was all on me. So, I was throwing together all sorts of partnerships and publicity and whatever, and I did, make an arrangement with a nonprofit called Donors Choose that some of you might be familiar with. It helps people fund particular projects in public school classrooms, and it was, worked nicely with my message of, helping kids kind of get in touch with their inner giver. And so I arranged with them to get, gift cards that I could give out as part of the launch. And there was this whole discussion at the New York Times about whether that was okay. And one of the upshots of it was that you can't ever write about them again, ever. As long as you're at the New York Times. And even though they weren't giving me any money, they were giving my readers these gift cards that they could exchange for the ability to fund these public school classrooms. So you would think that this would not raise hackles with anybody, but they're just sort of extremely careful there. The other thing that came up that gave me pause, actually just this morning, I stumbled into this again. There were a lot of questions then about, because all of these financial service firms now have their own, content operations, some of them contacted me when the book came out and said, can we interview you here at Vanguard for our newsletter? And I thought, that's amazing, right? They've got, how many people read their newsletter? That would be fantastic. And, the ethics czar at the paper was like, nope. And I said, well, but who could object to Vanguard? And he said, it doesn't matter. You're going to, you mentioned Vanguard. He went and checked. He said, you've mentioned Vanguard, 6 times in the last, 50 columns, so you'll probably do it again. And it's not okay. And then what happened after that was that LearnVest, which many of you remember was sort of the, the great hope of financial planning for the middle classes when it launched 3 or 4 years ago, LearnVest just went ahead and wrote about my book on their blog without interviewing me. So that thing was out there. I found out about it in a Google search. And then when LearnVest went and sold themselves off to the annuity peddlers in Milwaukee, and I had to write about it, I had to then mention in the piece that LearnVest had written about my book, and this was like a whole parenthetical disclosure in the column that was kind of icky. And there wasn't much I could have done about that. But those are the sort of things that kind of keep the New York Times up at night, just to give you a window into what I deal with and navigate whether I want to or not, as long as I want to stay employed by that institution.
And you spoke of disclosures, and that's our next question, is when you do have a conflict of interest or a perceived conflict of interest, how do you disclose? Where do you disclose? And Ron, I'll let you start with that.
So for me personally and for, the journalists who work there, the object of the game and the reason why, they have that ethics editor, there in the first place is so that no such disclosures are ever necessary. And sometimes the reasons you never see any disclosures is because often if there is a disclosure or the need for one, then the solution is you don't get to write that story. Which is not what you want as, somebody who chases stories for a living, right? So you try and avoid that situation. Now, there are a number of other layers of things that are happening now at the Times that, weren't happening 10 or maybe even 5 years ago. One of them is we have a whole division now known as T Brand Studio, and as branded content, became a thing 5 or 6 years ago. A determination was made that there's absolutely no reason, the Times should sit that out. And in fact, we could do it better than a lot of other places by hiring like really top drawer, content strategists and journalists to create, really lovely, interesting, beautifully designed campaigns. But that is going to be, separate. It's going to be marked in a way that's prominent, and I've never actually met any of the people that do that work. I don't know where they sit. And so, some of the Chinese walls have been, if not taken down, then sort of removed at our shop, but not that one. And it gets closer to me these days. We also have this sort of guides initiative we're trying to pay a lot more attention to service journalism at the Times. And one of the things we're trying to do is create these sort of evergreen guides on everything from, meditation and, kind of yoga 101. I did a retirement one 4 or 5 months ago, and we had this whole, sort of existential conversation about whether I should find out ahead of time who the sponsor was of that guide. And I ultimately decided I didn't want to know because I didn't even want, like, kind of in the back of my head, like, if it was, an insurance company that's in the 401k business, or if it was Vanguard, or, or something in between. I just didn't. I didn't want to be thinking about that when I was writing. It turned out it was a company that I had barely heard of. It was a spin-off of a larger financial services company. But, we decided ultimately that it would just be best to keep those things separate. But we can't make those guides without the sponsors. And if we're being honest with ourselves, right, part of the reason we're doing the guides in the first place is because we know that the sponsorship money is out there. And, while we definitely do want to do useful journalism, we're also trying as many new ways as we can to keep the lights on there. And this is one of them.
Jason, what disclosures do you
So for my blog, we do have the standard disclosure, the FTC disclosure, and I just do a blanket statement that chances are that any of the products that I do mention, it may be an affiliate relationship, and that's not the case. Probably like 1 in 4 of any of the products that we talk about, I do have an affiliate relationship with, but I do just make that to cover myself and to let people know. And so when I do represent brands as a brand ambassador, and I get paid a pretty hefty income with that, I always make sure that I use the hashtag sponsored or hashtag ad from Twitter to Instagram to Facebook. And Instagram and Facebook itself, they understand the power of influencers, so they make it easier as well for influencers to indicate that the post that we have is sponsored content by a brand. So I'm all about transparency. So if you look through any of my social media feeds, you'll see this, the hashtag sponsored, hashtag ad for any of the brands that I've worked with. And so maybe the contract has ended, but I still place sponsored or ad just so there is no confusion. So when they look at an old sponsored post, they understand that there was some type of relationship, paid relationship. So I'm very clear and transparent about that.
Literally what he said. I mean, pretty much, like we have a standard disclosure on AskTheMoneyCoach.com on our blog. And for me, the affiliate link thing, it's just not a big part of my business or it's just so, it's kind of rare for us. But on the sponsored content side, I don't know, out of 1,600 plus articles on my site, there may be 12, 15, I don't know, 20 or so sponsored ads or sponsored articles over the years. And we do the same thing. They're clearly identified and disclosed as such. And certainly on social media, exact same thing. Hashtag sponsored, hashtag ad. And usually I'll just do hashtag ad because 140 characters makes it easier. Ditto for something, if we put something on Facebook and it's a company that we have a relationship with, we'll disclose that as well there.
Okay. So I didn't know about that. So when I signed on as a USA brand ambassador, they put us through a course to make sure that if there was ever an exchange between money and talking about the brand, that we were very transparent and clear. And so I learned that from a brand to make sure that it was clear that there was money exchange for that conversation, for that tweet.
JD.
Well, I've kind of been out of this world for a long time. So when I sold Get Rich Slowly, I think the FTC regulations were just being discussed or being put into place. So I've never had to deal with this. So I'm learning just as you guys are learning from this kind of thing here. Now, there are situations, though, where I have done disclosures or just because I felt like I ought to. And one of those is definitely in book reviews. I know a lot of people who write books and publish books, and they send me their books and they want me to review them. And so I try to make it very, very clear, not necessarily that I've been sent a book, but that I know the person who wrote the book. And in particular, I'm good friends with Chris Guillebeau, and he always wants me to review his books. And so I don't actually do reviews of Chris's books because I don't think that's a fair thing to do. I just say up front, hey, I'm friends with Chris Guillebeau, this is his new book, and this is some of the material in it, but I'm not going to offer a review. And I just try to make that very, very clear. One thing, because I haven't had to deal with the disclosure stuff in the past, I have had an approach, though, that has made me feel comfortable with how I'm handling, say, affiliate links, because that's really the only thing I've ever really done. I don't do sponsored posts, and I won't ever do sponsored posts. But affiliate links, I have never said, okay, hey, look, here's an affiliate offer. I really like this offer. It pays a lot. How can I write about this? I don't approach things like that. For me, I'm uncomfortable doing that. And I'm not saying that's wrong for everybody, but it's definitely wrong for me. For me, I write an article, and I get the article done, and then I think, okay, is there a way to monetize this? And if there is a way to monetize it, I'll do it, and that makes me feel comfortable. But going forward with disclosure, I've got to figure out how to do it.
Hey, Liz, can I add one more thing there? So I forgot to mention that the New York Times, speaking of affiliate links, recently acquired the Wirecutter, which, and also the Sweet Home. I see some nods of recognition, which is great. If you don't know it, it's a really terrific, super rigorous product review site. Imagine Consumer Reports kind of rebuilt for the web. The whole thing is run off of or funded by affiliate links, most of which are through Amazon. And I should try and be careful about what I say here, at least a little careful. One of the bits of hand-wringing in the newsroom around that was, we try to cover Amazon really aggressively on one hand, but on the other hand, Amazon is literally filling our hand, with dollars and nickels and quarters and pennies. And, how does that look? And the determination was made was that readers would trust us. It's not like we've been soft on Amazon. I had a slightly different feeling about it personally, just because I'm of mixed minds about sort of Amazon hegemony generally, and they went out of stock on my book on the day it came out. And they were out of stock for 8 days and only went back into stock on the day that I just so happened to be showing up at Amazon to do their fishbowl for their employees. So I guess they were a little embarrassed that I was going to be coming and my book was out of stock on their super large site. So I'm having trouble getting sort of comfortable with that one, and yet. Nobody wants to trash talk Amazon because the next time they have something to sell, I think Amazon was 40% of my book sales or something. So, it's mixed up on a number of levels. For all of us, I think personally and professionally, there the affiliate part of it.
We were talking about the branded studio issue. I wanted to come back to that because there's a lot of mainstream media that's picked that up. So Lynnette, I want you to talk about how you approach those relationships, how you evaluate them.
Well, I've had a number of mainstream media outlets that have started branded studios, not T Studio from the Times, but others, network TV outlets that have their own, as well as mainstream, some major print side studios, and not done any deals as of yet, but will very soon be doing one. I can't announce it here, but I definitely will. And in general, though, I think the sort of overriding guidance there, frankly, it's going to be a lot driven by what the organization sets in terms of their own rules, but certainly, regardless of whether you might do a branded sort of studio deal with a TV operation or a podcast or print outlet, you really do have to make disclosures about, like, XYZ organization is sponsoring this podcast series or this segment, and it's already sort of done, so it's not like the biggest ethical challenge. I think in terms of deciding which opportunities an author, a former journalist, a blogger, or whatever you want to call somebody like me, money coach, etc., is a little bit, I do think about brand alignment. I do think about who the sponsor is, and is this a brand that I trust, that I know, that has a good reputation? Because if they are known to have a bad reputation, or I really don't care how much money they have to offer to a network or to a newspaper to acquire me as talent to do it, I just don't want to be affiliated with them. So for me, the decision-making process is generally, let me see about the brand, if I'm comfortable with the brand, or specifically products or services. For the most part, for brands that I work with a few exceptions, I don't like, I'm not the one who has to pitch or push their product or service. Something that says sponsored by XYZ is kind of like almost like an announcer saying it. I do have clients where I've worked with on the very directly, where I make disclosures, they make disclosures. It's apparent that we have a relationship. I do aggressive sort of media outreach with them. something, for example, like I did a TV commercial with Credit Sesame, which is a client of mine that I've worked with. And did somebody just go?
Editor of mine, I'm sorry.
For 15 years, I've written a ton about credit. I wrote a book called Perfect Credit. I've been extremely proactive in telling consumers, and we all have our differences of opinion on some of this stuff too, which is kind of one of the takeaways here. A decade ago, I was a person saying, you should really be monitoring your credit like all the time. It's really super important. And I just see it as an educational tool, as a way to see like, oh, I charged more on my credit card last month, and this is what happened to my credit score as a result. Or I applied for a credit card, and that inquiry made my credit score go down by 10 points, or whatever. So I was one of those sort of voices in the wilderness, and I'm sure Ron will disagree with me, and I've had many other people disagree with me on this. For example, like in my dreams, if I sort of had my druthers, I would try to get everything. I would want things to be free for consumers, and I actually do think we're kind of trending toward that. But long story short, I do think some things are actually worth paying for. I'm not pitching you and trying to say anything about, because Credit Sesame's thing is free, but just in general, a decade ago, when I didn't have a relationship with them or anything like that then, when I would say, like, you should be, looking at your credit, you should use credit monitoring. I talked about different services that I use from, my FICO and Quizzle, and, just because I wanted to learn more about credit and to sort of see. Some people, flat out disagreed with me. They were like, no, why should people have to pay? And, I just thought it was something of value. So anyway, long story short, a brand like that, because I'm so known for talking about credit and debt issues, I liked what they were doing, and I was comfortable. And I'm like, yeah, I help them to teach people about how to improve your credit health, and I'm okay with that. And it's fine for me to feel good about that, and I don't have any qualms about it.
Thank you. Now, Jason, you're an NCAA approved speaker.
Yes.
And there's a process involved in that. Would you talk about that? And also how you deal with the issue of being, I don't know how you put it, but you basically don't promote the brands that sponsor the programs?
Yeah, so back in 2015, when I started the Road to Financial Wellness, where we were breaking the social taboo all across the country, I was working with universities, community organizations, and so SMU here in Dallas reached out, and they wanted me to do a financial education class geared to student athletes. So we went through this whole entire process. We're going to get the football team, the basketball team, every single sport at SMU through this event that we were creating on campus. So 24 hours before our event would start, I get an email, phone call, a text message saying that NCAA has squashed the event. So the university had approved, we went through that whole entire process, but they needed to get the NCAA approve the program, approve me as a speaker before, because there would be some indication that NCAA was, aligned with Frugal, aligned with me. So that was my first experience. Eventually, I was contacted by UCLA. They wanted to do a program geared to student athletes, and they went through the proper channels, basically vetting my background, my degrees, vetting the book. So they had a team of folks. Yeah, a team of folks, just to make sure. So, but we were able to educate all the student athletes at UCLA for an entire day, 3 sessions. So it was an extensive process, and from that has opened up doors to all the universities that are part of that NCAA program. What's interesting is that the school does not pay me. The school works with financial institutions, credit unions or large banks that fund the what's called life services. So there is a life services department at universities who are geared to educating students about different aspects of life. So this particularly is in finance. And so they're not allowed to speak themselves. So a financial institution can't have a rep talk, because then it looks like they're selling a product or service. So they go ahead and they hire individuals. And so what I make sure is that they never speak at the event whatsoever. They can have a booth, but we're not allowed to talk about any of their products And they're even wary about mentioning the brand or the financial institution more than once. So a simple, thank you. For instance, with UCLA, it was Westcom Credit Union. They are the official sponsor for the Rose Bowl, and so I was only allowed to mention them once, and they sat in the back and did not speak whatsoever. So it's very tight and heavily regulated.
I promised time for Q&A, so I want to do this as a lightning round. The Times has a 54-page code of ethics, and I will tweet out the link to that if you guys want to see what the strictures that Ron lives under. Basically, every professional journalism association has a code of ethics. I'll send out those links so you guys can take a look at what was there. But I want to ask my panelists in 30 seconds, if they can, or less, should financial bloggers have a code of ethics, and what is the most important rule? And I'm starting with JD.
I think that each financial blogger should have a code of ethics. I think that it might vary from person to person, but I think it's very important that each of you figure out what your code of ethics is, become clear on it, and decide what you're going to do when you're confronted with an opportunity to go against that code of ethics. You need to know how you're going to handle a situation. What's going to happen when somebody comes and offers you $20,000 for one post?
Since we started off, on Murderer's Row, let me just say no. Honestly, I don't think that financial bloggers should have a code of ethics. And kill me now, I know, Ron. So I'm really saying this honestly, having been on both sides as a traditional journalist and then now as a business owner. Bottom line, I do think it's great to have a set of best practices, to have guidelines, as JD said, to know individually. If you run and operate a blog or your own business, you're an entrepreneur. Obviously, you're not subjected to the same type of limitations as, say, a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal or whatever. So really, the code of ethics, so to speak, should really be around, and at the end of the day is going to be, unless you join a membership organization and they have a code of ethics and you abide by theirs, but for you individually, it's going to be, can I sleep at night knowing I did the right thing? Can I look at myself in the mirror and know that I didn't do my readers a disservice, or my listeners or my viewers, et cetera. So in general, because we also have, CFPB and FTC, other guidelines that, of course, on the legal front that we all have to abide by or should be abiding by, I think that's a good start. But as a whole, as an industry, for financial bloggers, do I think that we should adopt a universal one? I'm not so sure about that. I lean towards the no, just because does it mean later that if you were in an affiliation with, say, Fincon or some membership group, you have to literally go by every single thing? And I think that it really is an individual decision for each person about what you can live with and what you feel is kind of right for you.
Jason?
Yeah, I think everyone should have a philosophy for living. You should understand your values, and you should, those values that you have personally should be the same values you hold in your business. You are your business, you are the blogger, it is your thoughts, it is your opinion. So I do believe that there should be some standard or guideline, what have you, and be forward, be transparent about what those are. I have that on all my sites in terms of my philosophy for living, what my values are, what I stand for, and that helps me filter through the brands that I work with, that filters the people I want to work with, the companies, the sponsored opportunities.
Ron, what do you think we should do?
I think you can sum it up in 7 words, Michael Pollan style, right? When in doubt, disclose. In fact, over-disclose. I think that solves for almost everything, right? And I also want to, I was thinking about this personally a couple panels ago, and Stephanie O'Connell, some of you may know, was speaking at a not dissimilar panel a couple hours ago. And she, talked about like the way that she checks herself is that in instances like the ones that we've been talking about, she says, well, I try and think about like, what's the lifetime value of this reader, who I might scare away or offend if I sort of step out of line somehow. And she also described sort of the pressures that many of you are under, depending on the relationships you are considering. She said, the commercial kind of tension here is that the more mainstream the brand, and often the more money that brand has, as a result, the more mainstream your appeal has to be. And I thought about that, and I thought, that's not actually what I want to be mainstream. I want to be the trusted person who throws bombs and asks inconvenient questions and shines light into dark corners so that the rats scatter in fear. That's what I want to be. And so I don't know what that's worth exactly. It's probably worth less than whatever the mainstream is. But I can't be my sort of authentic, true self in any other way. So there you have it.
And Ron mentioned being a trusted source of information, and for me, I think this is a very important thing that it's kind of been like a subtext here, but hasn't been in the forefront. For me, my readers trust me, and I want to maintain that trust. And if I do something to violate that trust, they're going to never trust me again. And so it's very important to me that in the way that I handle advertising, and financial opportunities, I do things that aren't going to betray the reader's trust.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. So we do have a short period for Q&A, and there's a hand in the back.